Howdy, everyone. My name is Deacon Sam. I'm a seminarian for the Diocese of Joliet. I've been a transitional deacon for the past 7 or 8 months, and I'm scheduled to be ordained a priest this coming June. Just as a mode of introduction, I want to answer some common questions I get. I'm originally from the Joliet area. I am the third of 4 kids, and I am old enough to be doing this. Each year, the diocese sends us seminarians out to 2 different parishes within the diocese just to talk about the way that God led us to the priesthood in the hopes of helping any young men or women who are also considering a call to priesthood or religious life. But before I get into that, I want to quickly touch upon something about today's feast. As you may know, today we celebrate the feast of the dedication of St. John Lateran. It's this kind of weird feast that's dedicated to the dedication of a physical church building. And it's a big enough deal that it actually trumps the normal Sunday celebration. But in many ways, St. John Lateran is the basilica of the entire church. It's over 1,700 years old. It dates back to the time of Constantine. And it's the cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. That's why it's considered the mother church of the whole church. But if we look at our prayers and our readings for today, they draw our attention beyond this one physical church building. Rather, they draw us to the church as a whole. Our opening prayer near the beginning of Mass today began with these words: "O God, who from living and chosen stones prepare an eternal dwelling for your majesty." In saying this, the church teaches us that the main way in which God constructs his church is by choosing us as the stones with which he builds. So it's worth asking ourselves, do we think of ourselves as living stones? Do we see our lives as the way in which God desires to build up his church? Because if we do that, if we take that seriously, everything begins to change. Suddenly, our life is no longer an accident and of an uncaring universe, and it's never something that's completely our own. Rather, our life becomes a mission. It's something we've been given and that we're invited to put to good use. For each of us, this mission is going to look different, but the result will always be the same. If we live out the mission that God gives us, the church will begin to be built up. Lives will be changed, souls will be set on fire, and our life on earth will echo our life to come in heaven. But this all begins with letting God lead us where he wants to lead us and how he wants to lead us. And it takes some time to recognize what this looks like. Personally, as I look back on how God has drawn me to himself and eventually to the priesthood, I'm struck by the relationships that he placed within my life and how he used those relationships to draw me onward. The first example of these relationships that I just kind of want to highlight came while I was still a young kid, about 10 years old. Growing up, my family was Catholic, but it was only ever a part of our life and never really at the center. We went to Mass each Sunday. I attended the local Catholic grade school, but that was about the extent of my faith. This began to change, however, when a group of Dominican sisters from Nashville ended up coming to our parish, and one of them, Sister Mary Claire, became my 4th grade teacher. For a young 10-year-old Sam, seeing Sister Mary Claire walk around with her long veil, her habit, and her giant rosary clinking everywhere she went was one of the coolest things I'd ever seen. But the thing that struck me the most about her was her constant attitude of joy. The power of the gospel was a strong reality in her life in a way that I had never encountered in others before. She was willing to answer our class's many questions about life as a sister or just about church teaching in general. And I remember even from a young age, it instilled in me that confidence that the church did have the answers to the questions I was asking. It was from Sister's example that I really started to understand that a life given over to God and his church could be a profoundly joyful one. And it was the way she lived that led me to first consider the priesthood. The second example that God gave me was that of my pastor, Father Michael Lane. While he'd been at the parish for most of my life, I really started to get to know him near the end of my time in junior high, when my mother ended up taking a job as a secretary over at the parish rectory. Every day after school, I would go over to the offices and finish up my homework while my mother finished up her work. And I just got to see Father Michael in the way he lived his day-to-day life, the way he interacted with others, and the way he lived as a priest. If Sister Mary Claire had first led me to consider the priesthood as a possibility, it was Father Michael who made it seem like an awesome and amazing reality. Through his example, he taught me what it means for a priest to truly be a father. Even after the most frustrating meetings with the angriest of parishioners, he'd wave his hands around and say, "All this in heaven too," reminding us that even the difficult moments were gifts from God. Like Sister, he always seemed so joyful despite the busyness of life. And he left an example of a saintly priest that has remained with me to this day. A priest who is not only a leader, but a father. The last example that I wanted to highlight was that of several of my friends back in high school. I ended up going from a Catholic grade school to a public high school, and I remember being very nervous about this transition, wondering if my faith would even survive the change. But through the grace of God, going to a public high school ended up being one of the most important steps, both in my relationship with God and in my eventual call to the priesthood. Unlike my Catholic grade school, where everyone believed what I believed, being at a public high school forced me to be more intentional about my own faith. There weren't many other practicing Catholics there, but I ended up becoming very close friends with a number of other young men whose own faiths were major parts of their lives. I was good friends with the son of a Lutheran minister, a non-denominational Protestant, and even a Mormon. For each of us, our faith was important, and we were curious about each other's faith. Over the course of many lunch hours and after-school activities, we would discuss the different things we believed and why we believed them. Through these discussions, I was forced to examine my own faith and consider what was so important about it to me. And for me, time and time and time again, the answer was always the same. It was the Eucharist. Even with all that I heard about my friends' different beliefs, nothing could compare to the actual presence of God at every single Mass. The more I discussed the Eucharist with my friends, the more attention I paid to it at Mass, and the more I felt called to share the Eucharist with others for the rest of my life. Something I will soon be doing in a very special way. Through the grace of God, I began to recognize that same joy of the gospel and the Eucharist that had animated the lives of Sister Mary Claire and Father Michael Lane, and I began to see it in my own life. Over the course of high school, God nurtured this desire to grow stronger and stronger until eventually I was no longer stubborn enough to ignore it. In the fall of my senior year of high school, I applied to seminary and I was accepted a couple months later. The 8 years that have followed have been filled with more graces than I could have ever imagined. The truth is, applying to seminary was one of the first steps and definitely not the last. God's given me this time to grow into who I am today. A man who, while still unworthy of this call, is a lot closer to who he's calling me to be. Now, with all that being said, I want to thank you all for the support that you've given to vocations within the Diocese of Joliet. And I want to just bring up a couple things the diocese asks us to mention. I know I speak from personal experience and the experience of many of my brother seminarians when I say that it would be impossible for us to make it through seminary without the support of men and women like you. It costs roughly $50,000 every year to send a man through seminary. And as I mentioned, I entered right out of high school. I never could have afforded that on my own. The diocese has this thing called the Seminary and Endowment Fund, which is a fund that's used to help support and cover the costs for the education of seminarians. And I know every one of our seminarians has had to draw upon it at different points. Today, there's going to be a second collection taken up in support of that fund. Just know in advance that we're very thankful for your generosity. Finally, and most importantly, regardless of whether you can support us financially, we ask for your prayers. I know that personally, nothing has been more humbling to me than when someone who I've never met before comes up to me and tells me they've been praying for me for 6 or 7 or 8 years. And I just have to imagine all the ways that their prayers impacted my life. I know especially early in my seminary journey, there was several difficult moments where I came very close to leaving. And I'm confident it was the prayers of men and women like all of you that got me through those moments. If you're looking for an additional way to pray for seminarians, the diocese has given us a bunch of these prayer calendars. The idea is that each day of the month, there's a different seminarian that you can pray for. I'm partial to the first day myself. And the idea is you just make us part of your daily prayers. I've got a bunch of them in back. I'll be handing out some in back afterwards. Please feel free to pick them up. Noah will be praying for you as well. After Mass today, I'll be in back if you want to discuss anything, you want to introduce yourself, or just have any questions. I'm looking forward to meeting you all. Thank you for having me here this weekend, and may God bless you all.